2. How's the audio back there? S6, S7, S9?
What?
S9, good. All right. We'll get started here. First off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and this is not showing up real well. And it's not showing the slide correctly either. I'm going to have to see. Let me see. Okay, let's see if this works. I don't know. This is a different program than I normally use. This is Open Office. I usually just use PowerPoint. A little bit about myself. I was first licensed in 1969. So this month, last month, I celebrated 51 years as a ham. My Elmer was Leo Meyerson, W0, get fat quick. How many people know what he was famous for? That's right, World Radio Labs in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And he was my personal Elmer. He introduced me to shortwave listening when I was 7 or 8 years old. And then by the time I was 14, I took my novice class at World Radio Laboratories.
I bought his QSLs.
Oh, really?
He had the United States Council bus. And he had an arrow pointing to your QPA.
Yep, exactly. Anyways, I'm originally from Omaha, Nebraska. I still work there, but not daily anymore. I am now mostly retired. I'm only on call once or twice a week. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, so my commute to work every day for 20 years was 50 miles each way each day. My real world job is an IT field tech. I go out and find broken printers and fix them. Also broken networks and Wi-Fi troubleshooting, which is a big problem right now. I write the monthly kit building column in CQ magazine. I have for over 10 years, about 10 and a half years now, I have written that column monthly.
Thank you.
I also do the construction techniques chapter in that big thick ARL handbook they have on sale, and I'm glad to sign them and stuff. I have a lot of people that come up to me, especially at Hamvention, that are trying to collect signatures from the biggest number of authors of the book, and that kind of surprised me, but I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I do annual updates for them. I have spoken at Dayton 31 times, and I keep busy. A lot of people send me new kits to try out and see how they work. Let me see how this goes. All right. This is not going to show up very well because it cuts off stuff from the bottom. So we're going to talk about kit suppliers, who's in and who's out. Number one, QRPkits.com. They come from Arkansas now. They used to be in Silicon Valley. And they make the wall wart tamer kit, which is what I've been using lately as my training kit. We did a group kit build for the Orlando Club. And by the way, I'll go just about anywhere to put on a group kit build. And we had like 15 builders, and they all built power supplies, and not a one of them blew up. QRPguys.com is a newer supplier. They have some really exciting low-cost kits, including a 2-watt FT8 transceiver kit. And I even printed a case for it with the 3D printer. On their website, they have the 3D printer file, and all I did was run it through my slicer, and away I went, and I printed the case for it. 4SQRP.com. That is the 4-state QRP group. All the kits that we sell as the 4-state QRP group goes to putting on OzarkCon in Branson, Missouri. Makes it a very, very affordable convention. I think the hotel only charges like 60-something a night. And Branson is a great tourist place to go, lots of shows and so forth. And we make a lot of kits that are designed by a guy named David Kripe, NM0S. and he is a senior level engineer for Rockwell Collins, so he is a Collins radio engineer. Velleman still makes kits, and those are sold through Jameco and Fry's, although Fry's I think is going out of business. Olenco kits are also available online. Elecraft is here, and they still sell the K2 as a kit. They have lots of small kits and some big kits, including their amplifier as a kit. DZ Kit comes from Colorado, and they make a transceiver kit called the Sienna, and it's around $3,800, but it's a high-end transceiver, and all the surface mount is done for you. All you got to do is the through-hole parts. MFJ is here. Nightfire kits I thought was going to be here. They are not. They are not here this year, but if you live around here, they're not far away. They are in Ocala. So Ocala's, I'm guessing, what, about an hour, hour and a half away from here. So not far away. Who's out? Heathkit. They were the big one. 1994 they went away. Now there's a new Heathkit, but they have a very limited amount of kits out there. Ramsey Electronics, they're gone too. They kind of came in about the time Heathkit was going out, and they're gone too. Tentec, unfortunately, I think they're on what, their third or fourth owner in the last few years, and they don't have any kits either anymore.
Did MFJ take over Tentec?
No, no. It's an amplifier company. I can't remember the name, but they took it over. Before you begin putting together your kit, you need to make a list of things you're going to need. Do you need a key? Do you need a headset? A multimeter or a scope is very handy. I saw lots of analog scopes out in the flea market, and they don't get a lot of money for those anymore, so there's no excuse not to have a scope. A reference receiver is a must, and I'll tell you why, because the worst thing in the world is to put together a kit, hook it up to the outside world, and hear nothing. At least you hear static, maybe. Guess what? We're in the bottom of the sunspot cycle. The bands suck, okay? So you build a 40-meter receiver and might have had a solar flare or something, and the band is dead. So it's good to have a reference receiver hooked to a known good antenna so you can see, hey, on my ICOM 7610, am I hearing all sorts of signals? And if I hook this 40-meter receiver to the same antenna, not working, then it's the kit. If it is working, you're going to hear something. Do you need a headset? Do you need a speaker to test your kit? A key or a paddle? There's some kits that you use the paddle to program the bands and so forth. One of the QRPKits.com kits do that. A dummy load and or antenna is what I put up there. The problem with a lot of QRP kits is there's no VSWR protection. And because there's no VSWR protection, guess what? You're going to blow your finals if you're in an open or a short condition. So you want to hook it up to a dummy load first and have that reference receiver nearby so you can hear that signal and see what it's putting out. Or if you have a good antenna, that works too. On my bench, I have both. I have a vertical antenna that's broadband that's outside. That brings the outside world in, but I flip the switch the other way and I'm on a dummy load. So I can make sure I protect the kit either way. Do you need 12 volts DC? Do you need AC power? You need an extra outlet. Do you need a 9-volt battery, AA, AAA batteries? Always check to see what it needs before you go. And tuning tools. I've had people bring kits to me all the way in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they say, I can't get this thing to tune. And I asked them, well, what did you use to tune that slug? And it turns out they used a hex key set, okay? Not only did the key detune it when it got within a few inches of it, but it shattered the core. So you got to be really careful about that. Some nice things that you want to keep on hand. And by the way, how many people here have built before? This is great. That's great. Fantastic. One of the things I found in the Swaps building, there was one guy, and I can't remember where he was. They sell assortments of parts. What you're going to want to have is primarily 1/4 watt resistors and some 8 watt resistors. You can order these assortments online. There's several suppliers that have these, and you're not going to spend a whole lot of money for it. But the reason you want to have these assortments of parts is, what if there's a modification to the kit? They say, oh, by the way, we changed this 10K resistor to a 100K resistor. Okay, you got to have one of those nearby. Or you might find out that the side tone pitch might be too low or too high for you, and they'll tell you, hey, if you change this value to that, it's going to sound better. Okay, there might be some updates or something to the kit, so you're going to want to have standard parts. The other thing is, how many of you have a Radio Shack within an hour's drive of you? Not very many. We're fortunate in Lincoln, Nebraska. We don't have a full-blown Radio Shack store, but we have Hobbytown USA, who has an aisle of Radio Shack products. And so you might look at Hobbytown USA stores. Their corporate headquarters happens to be in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I live, and their first prototype of that was opened about 1.5 years ago, and so I got to see that, and very, very interesting. Some of the kits will just have a plus and a minus on the board. Do you need a 9-volt battery snap or battery holders? I have seen a zillion vendors here that have 9-volt battery snaps and holders. And they're a good thing to have on hand in case you're fixing old transistor radios or other old kits. It's always good to have extra battery holders and battery snaps. Why? Because batteries happen to leak, okay? And the first thing they destroy is the battery holder or the battery snap. There are common used plugs and jacks. 1/4-inch plugs, 1/8-inch plugs, 2-3 conductor. Find out what your kit needs. Does it have an SMA output, but you've got a BNC? Or does it have an SMA and you've got an SO239 and PL259 to go to the outside world? What do you have? So make sure you find out what you need. And it's always good to have some of all these in these little parts bins you can get at Harbor Freight. 12-volt coaxial plugs. Most kits use the 2.1 millimeter. That seems to be the standard. And most often the center pin is positive, but not always. So make sure you check your kit. Solder wick is a must to clean the holes in circuit boards. Sometimes it happens when you're desoldering parts. Sometimes it happens while you're soldering and a little bit of solder drips into a hole that you weren't working on. But a little bit of solder wick, and you touch your soldering iron tip to it, and by the way, turn up your temperature when you do that. That will clean up the hole right away. If you're an addict to building kits like me, you probably want to invest in a vacuum desoldering tool. It can be as simple as a hollow tipped iron that has a suction bulb on it. Radio Shack used to sell those. You can still find those online. All the way up to these electric ones that you pull the trigger and it sucks up the solder. An emery board. We're going to be talking about toroids in a little bit. Enameled wire is one of those headaches that we deal with as kit builders, but I'll give you a few techniques on how to take care of that. Where do I get all my emery boards? You go to the home show, the state fair, the county fair, whatever, and you go buy these tables and they got emery boards, and I see them, boom, in the bag. Okay, now I got this year's supply of emery boards. They come in great handy when you're dealing with enameled wire. Choosing the right soldering iron. This particular one is an Xtronics, and it's xtronicusa.com. That got cut off from the bottom. This thing sells for around $60, so you don't have to spend a huge amount of money to have a precision temperature-controlled soldering iron. I'm kind of prejudiced to this because somebody from Ohio told me, I ordered a new soldering station that was mailed to me from Lincoln, Nebraska. And I said, Lincoln, Nebraska? That's where I live. I'd never heard of this place. Well, I contacted them and found out that they were looking for me because they know I talk about kit building and stuff. And they sell primarily to the commercial market. But this particular soldering station sells for around $60. It'll hold the temperature within 2 degrees Celsius. It comes with 2 different kinds of tip cleaners. It has a sleep mode, so it doesn't stay hot and burn up the tip all day. And it's got a solder roll holder. That actually is very useful. That comes from xtronicusa.com. And they have a whole line of soldering stations and soldering tools. And I was just amazed at what they had. They took me around the plant and pretty much filled my car with samples. And I've had a lot of fun testing them out and writing about them. Some nice things to have, variable voltage power supply, especially one that's metered. Now, we made a variable voltage power supply in the kit build on Wednesday night, but it's only about 1.5 amp output, which is probably adequate for a lot of kits like the SCAF and things like that. The reason you want to have meters, especially dual meters, is because you want to be watching the voltage you're putting into the kit. Now, if you're playing with one of these Chinese Pixie kits and it's drawing about 3 amps, chances are you're going to be letting out the magic smoke from some of those black plastic things in there. So you want to know how much current that kit is drawing so you know if it's working correctly or not. And some kits actually ask you to measure the current, in which case you probably want a more precision meter than is in the power supply, but it's always good to have that as well. A frequency counter is very useful. You're going to want to see what frequency the local oscillator is on receivers, and you might want to calibrate it, and you might want to see if your transmitter is in the band, because that's one of our primary responsibilities as hams, is to keep within our bands. We talked about scopes earlier. I find analog scopes with CRTs very, very cheap in flea markets now. There are scope kits as cheap as $23 online, and it's a kit, and we'll show that in a little bit. But that's the webpage, banggood.com. I don't know why they have a name like that, but that's where I get some of those kits. We spoke about dummy loads earlier. That is a must. You're building something new, and once again, our responsibility is to not have spurious radiation, things like that, bother other nets or other QSOs. So we want to have a good dummy load so we can check those transmitters. A vacuum desoldering station, that's if you're an addict like me. The Hakko 808 looks like the big old Weller soldering guns, okay? And it's just a big giant gun, and you just put it over the connection, you hold it down, you pull the trigger, sucks up the solder, and away you go. And that works really well. General coverage receiver, we have talked about the reference receiver. It's great for checking the band conditions and entertainment and seeing what things sound like. Or an AM/FM clock radio does well. I only have one caution. I like to have the radio on, the broadcast radio on, or shortwave broadcast while I'm building my kits. I only ask one favor, and that is kit building is supposed to be a pleasant and enjoyable experience. Don't listen to talk shows, okay? They're only designed to tick you off, okay? So I listen to my favorite classic rock radio station that's right there in Lincoln, and the station IDs are what reminds me it might be time for dinner or something. I'll look up and I'll be winding a toroid, and I hear the legal ID on the hour. Oh, it's 3 o'clock. I get back to work, and pretty soon I hear another darn legal ID. I thought, oh, ooh, an hour's gone by, but that means we're having fun. That's the enemy of all kit builders.
They like to scatter everything.
Yeah. The one on the left is Tesla, and the one on the right is 19 pounds, and that's Newton. So this is how we take care of that. We get one of these tackle boxes. Plano still sells this as the 1354, but if you buy it at Michael's, it's going to be lavender and pink, okay? If you get it at Cabela's or Bass Pro, something like that, that's pretty much what it's going to look like. If you get it at Menards, they're yellow and black. So it's the same thing, and usually it's several different prices, so watch out. I got a couple of those a couple weeks ago for 11 bucks each at Menards, so you never know. It's got 4 pull-out trays, and each one of those has resizable bins, so I can sort out my parts, and I can put the boards and stuff in the top of it. So I can have 4 kits going at the same time, and I can just put them away and work on them later, because I'm always working about 3, 4, 5 months out. I'm already working on my May, June, and July kits for CQ Magazine. and I've already submitted April. So when you're sorting your parts, you can use a metal cupcake tin. Now what's that good for? You can ground it. Okay, so if you don't have cats or kids around the house, that's probably one of the nice things you can use is a cupcake tray. And you can get them in what, 6, 12, and 16 holers. And you can ground it for ESD. You guys know what ESD stands for? Electrostatic discharge. Here you're fortunate, you have high humidity levels, okay? Where I live, it is 18 degrees right now. I just checked, 18 degrees in Lincoln, Nebraska. When you bring that 18 degree air up to 70 degrees in the house, what does the humidity do? It goes down to zilch, okay? So I walk across and I touch something metal, kazap, right? But how many volts does it take to make that kazap? Maybe a couple thousand volts, just not a lot of current. But how many volts does it take to zap a CMOS part? About 30 volts, okay? You're never gonna feel that. You don't even know it happened. So anyways, we'll go back to the tray here. What I do is I sort the parts that I use most commonly closest to me. So I'm gonna put what part is usually the most common in a kit. Resistors, okay? Got lots of resistors. So where are they? Right there, okay? What's next? Disc capacitors, okay? Those guys are here and there, okay? Then you got electrolytics, and you've got semiconductors, diodes, chokes, so forth. And then you got your mechanical parts and knobs and so forth in the back. Because you're either gonna use those first or you're gonna use those last. But the ones you're gonna be reaching for most often, you're gonna want those in front. Now when you do a kit stage by stage, these are the more complex kits. And they're gonna have instructions that have you go step by step. And the neat thing about a stage by stage kit is, I sort the parts like this. Okay, that's number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Those are the different steps. So when I'm done with that step, guess what? I'm out of parts. Okay, so the parts are already sorted, and I have a lot of great stopping points. Okay, so I can go answer my work calls or my emails or whatever. The neat thing about a case like this is, when I step away, what do? Close the lid, snap it closed.
What if you have parts left over?
Well, sometimes that happens, and I'll show you. So in a stage-by-stage kit, we go it from the power supply only. Almost all of them, that's how they do it. Why? Because you don't want to put 300 parts on a board and discover that the power supply is wrong and blows the whole thing up. So the power supply might be 8 components or something like that, or less. And then what they have you do is stop. And you've got to have the right tool at the right time. So you're going to have a meter and a power supply so you can put voltage to it. And you're going to power it up and you're going to see, oh, is there 8 volts here? Is there 9 volts here? Is there 13.8 over there? Is there 1 volt over there? They're going to tell you where you want to have those voltages. So make sure you have a meter available. The neat thing is that each stage is tested thoroughly before you go on. So if it doesn't work, how many parts did you put on the board? Not very many. So it's really easy to figure out what went wrong. So you're dealing with only like a small number of parts, anywhere from 3 or 4 parts to 8 or 10 or more. And what I've been doing is I put them in each compartment. I have a little number. And in fact, I could probably go back to the other thing. I don't know if it's going to let me do that. Okay. Oops. Okay, didn't want to do that. Okay. You'll see that I have a little slip of paper in there. In each one, it's got a number of which stage that is of the kit. So if I'm working on a complicated kit, I know what stage number I'm on. I don't even have to mark it in the book. I can just look in the box and I can see where I am. So once again, make sure you have the proper test equipment. Do you need earbuds? Do you need a speaker? Do you need a CW key? What do you need to test that at that point? But a lot of kits have no sequence at all. They just give you a bunch of parts and they might say, oh, but be sure you put this electrolytic capacitor in before you do that, otherwise it's never going to fit. Okay? So what do? My own personal preference is I work up the hierarchy of electronic parts. So what's the bottom of the hierarchy? Resistors. Okay? So I do all the resistors first. If there's no instructions that tell you what goes in what order, I do all the resistors, then I do the disc caps, then I do the electrolytics, then I do diodes and transistors and work my way up through specialty parts and ICs and so forth. The very last thing, if it's one that's non-sequential, is the chokes and toroids and things like that. But make sure you check the documentation carefully and look to see if there's any online help groups or things like that where people post to see if they've got any hints that might help it go a little easier. And make sure that the supply of each part is exhausted before going on. Okay, now you mentioned extra parts. There are reasons that we'll have extra parts in the kits. One of them is it might be multi-band. Okay, some of the Chinese Pixie kits have several different groups of capacitors in there. Why? Because it might be an option to put it on 30 meters or 40 meters or 20 meters, okay? So you might have a couple different values of capacitors. So guess what? If you have extra parts, you're going to want to make sure there's a reason why, and you want to check your board to make sure that all the parts are where they belong. But yes, there is a reason why you might have extra parts left over. The trouble with toroids. How many of you cringe when you see how many toroids are in a kit? Okay, a few of you. How many of you think it's no big deal? Ah, that's good. That's good. People are kind of evenly divided. Let's take a look at this toroid. What is this toroid actually? What is that? It's a transformer. Yep, you see the primary and the secondary. You see two turns here and you see the other turns going around. That is actually a transformer. The best thing I can tell you is if there is a toroid in the kit, they usually have pretty explicit directions because the kit maker isn't going to want to get pestered with phone calls, emails, and text messages all about winding a toroid. Now, how do we count the turns? Okay, we go on the inside of the donut. Okay, now this is actually a full turn, and that's a full turn too, even though it doesn't look like it goes all the way around, and it really doesn't. But we're counting how many times it's in the center of the donut. That's how they do the math. And they know that the entry and exit turn may not be completely around that same toroid, but enough that that's how they count the turns. So this is how many turns? 2. Okay, this, I'm not going to ask you to count that. But we always count the passes in the inside of the donut. Now to strip the wire, this is one of the headaches of kit building. And I've got this new tool that came from a place in Kansas City, and I don't have the name of it off the top of my head, that I just pull it along the wire and it scrapes it right off. It's really kind of neat. And I'm just playing with it, and I did write about it for the magazine.
You don't think your emery boards in there?
Yeah, otherwise it's emery boards. Now here's what I do when it's extra thick insulation. What I do is I take a cigarette lighter and I burn it off. Okay, so you end up with a black kind of a powdery stuff on there. And then I use the emery board to clean that off and make it nice and shiny. And what do I do next? Yeah, you bet. You want to tin it. Now this is a single-sided board, so you're not going to worry so much. But a lot of kits are double-sided boards. So what you're going to do is you're going to tin that so it makes good contact on both the top and the bottom of the board. Because it's not only making electrical contact, what else is it doing? Physical. Yeah, and it's making physical contact. What it's doing is it's holding that toroid still. So that toroid doesn't bounce around and flex and stuff and change its inductance and frequency. So what I do is I look for wire, if I can substitute, that's called thermalese wire, but it has to be the same gauge. And what thermalese wire has is it has insulation that melts at a high temperature. So what you do is you take the soldering iron, you turn the heat up all the way, you make a blob on the tip, and it's going to make a little smoke, so make sure you got a little fan or something, just a little muffin fan or computer chip fan works to blow the smoke away. And what you're going to do is you're going to run that blob of solder up and down that wire, and what's it going to do? It burns off the insulation and it tints it. So now you want to make sure that the tinning exists above and below the board, and away you go. But otherwise, you can use emery boards, and it cleans it up really, really nice. Some common mistakes we make. Some RF chokes look exactly like resistors, so you want to check their markings. Sometimes the edges of them, the ends of them are a little fatter than a normal resistor, and the leads that come out of them might be a little thinner than a normal resistor. Some of them are identical. So you want to make sure you check those color codes and check the markings on it. Double check your electrolytics and tantalum capacitors. If you hook those up backwards, they make wonderful firecrackers.
Especially the big ones.
That's right, and I have. 8th watt resistors are a particular pain. I don't see too many younger folks in here, so we're going to make sure you use a magnifying light. And what I do is I recommend using LED or fluorescent-based magnifying lights. And what we do is we're worried about the color temperature, because if you use an incandescent one, number one, when you raise your hand up, you're going to burn it. Okay, number two, brown is going to look like orange, which looks like red. And so it's going to be hard to discern the colors on those resistors. But if it's LED, bright white, not warm white, but bright white or fluorescent, it's going to look correct, and you're going to be able to identify those colors very easily. 8th watt resistors are really tiny, and I need that, and sometimes I use the double end of the magnifier. Diodes have a stripe on one end. Make sure that's correct too. You're not necessarily going to let the smoke out of them, but they won't work if they're turned the other way. And those little glass diodes, if you bend them too sharply, they'll break, because that's really fragile. So you got to be really, really careful when you're bending the leads on RF chokes and those little glass diodes. All right, now I'm going to play the guy from Ronco. It slices, it dices, it purees, whatever. Okay, this is a $12 component tester. It's sold online as a transistor tester kit. But what it does is it tells you what part is connected. It's got 3 connections. You can see 1, 2, and 3. It's marked on the board. So it doesn't come with test leads, at least this kit didn't. So I just take some of those clip leads you can buy for $1 or $2 a bag in the flea market, and I just cut off one end or cut them in half, and I strip the lead and tin it, and I put it in those terminals. So I have 3 different color leads. It doesn't matter what color they are as long as there's 3 different colors. And when I push the button on this, the LCD comes on, and this particular one, which you can't read, is saying that the battery is 9.1 volts and it's starting to test. Okay? Now when I put electrolytic capacitor on there, it's not only going to tell me the capacitance, it's also going to tell me if it's an electrolytic, the ESR, equivalent series resistance, which is telling me what? It's telling me if it's a good capacitor or a bad capacitor. This is a kit, by the way, and the display is already mounted on that board, but you're going to have to solder a bunch of smaller connectors and so forth. There's not a lot of super detailed directions for it, but the parts values are all marked on there, and it's actually not that bad to put together. That is available for about $12 online. This is another one, and I wish the vendor was here. It's Wired Communications. It comes from Scottsdale. Also, the place in Ocala has these. This particular kit, you don't have to solder anything. It comes already made, and it already works. The case is a kit, okay? There's no instructions on how to do the case. But all you gotta do is peel off the protective coating on the plastic and kind of play jigsaw puzzle, And make sure you put your battery in there first, because once you close it, you're not going to get it out until you take the case apart again. This one here will tell you also, like the other one, this one puts up a better graphic. It tells you if it's NPN or PNP, which lead is connected to the collector base emitter or drain gate and source, or if it's a thyristor or an SCR or a Darlington. It tells you what it is. It tells you if it's a MOSFET. It's absolutely amazing. I can put a diode in there and it tells me which is the anode and the cathode and what the voltage drop is. If I put a resistor in there, it tells me what the value is. Put a capacitor in there, it tells me what that is. An inductor, it's going to not only tell me the inductance, but it's going to tell me the DC resistance also. It's this amazing thing. These are about $18 or $19. You can't be without this if you're going to do a lot of building. This is a kit that's put out by the 4-state QRP group. It's called the Moranium. There's already 100 zillion mods for this thing. It's basically a 1 transistor radio, but it actually has another transistor in there that's used as a detector. And what it is a very simple regenerative AM broadcast receiver, but it doesn't have a regen control. That is fixed. I don't have the picture of the inside on this, but the parts are very clearly marked on the back side of the front panel. And all the parts do not solder through the board, they solder to pads on the board. And you just solder the lead to the pads, you just bend it up, solder it there, and then you trim it. This makes it a very ideal kit for a first-time kit builder or for a group kit building experience or a father-son thing or grandfather-son thing. It's a really, really fun kit, and it sounds good, depending on what programming you get on AM radio where you live. Okay, this is the wall wart tamer. This is the one we did as a group here in Orlando. This takes AC or DC input, anything from about 15 volts to 30 volts, AC or DC on the input. It's got a regulator and a pot, and you get anything from about 1.25 volts all the way up to about 16, 17 volts on the output. You can vary that, whatever you want it to be, it's going to be there, which, as you saw with these other kits, there's a lot of different voltages being used. I use old laptop power supplies. Thank God for Bill Gates. He made Windows 7 obsolete. So all of our customers at work were getting new laptops. I got to be in charge of stacking up the old ones for recycling. Guess what I did with the power supplies? Haha, I kept them. They're great inputs for these things. All I do is I cut the plug off, twist the leads, and tin them, and that's your input. The neat thing about the input of the power supply on this, because it takes AC or DC, you have a full wave bridge rectifier over here, okay? So it doesn't matter which lead is which on the input. Of course it does on the output. It's a fun kit to build. Most people, even first-time builders, got them together in about an hour. They had a working kit. So a lot of fun. Very easy kit. It sells for about $20, and you get that from qrpkits.com. 1.5 amps, which is more than adequate for a lot of kits that we make. This is the Cricket, okay? That looks pretty simple. What is that? That is a 30-meter CW transceiver, okay? And the receive quality on that is incredible. This is one of those designed by that Rockwell Collins engineer, David Kripe, NM0S. He said, we can do better than the Pixie, okay? Here's how we did better than the Pixie. There's no toroids to wind. Why? Where's the coils? They're on the board. It's spiral wound. It's a spiral on the board. So there's 3 inductors printed on the board. So we don't have to wind the coils, okay? What do you got? You got a BNC connector, you got a headphone jack, you got a key. The newer versions of these kits also now have a power on-off switch in the back, okay? Otherwise, you just take the battery off. With that 9-volt battery, how much power do you think we're actually putting out? Actually, 1 watt. we get 1 watt out of that thing. 1 watt. And what's interesting is the 80 meter version of that, which was the first one that he came out with, the frequency it's on is close enough to the ARRL code practice beacon frequency that when they turn that on, we can hear it and it sounds pretty good. And so what I did was, we were at Ozarkon and we built these things, and I took it up to my room and I had a wire strung out the window and I had my KX2 hooked to that wire. Sure enough, there's W1AW. It's only about an S1 or an S2. I hooked that up, put the headsets on it, and guess what? It's pretty good. You could actually hear it. Now, I'm not going to say it's as sensitive as the Yellowcraft, but it's pretty darn good. So you're going to make lots of neat QSOs with it. Now, what we've done, another modification is, instead of soldering the crystal, we solder either a machine pin socket or a piece of an IC socket in there, and now we can change crystals. We can put it on whatever frequency we want within that band. This is a newer kit. This was introduced last April at Ozarkon. This is a 75 meter AM transceiver, okay? But it also has a general coverage shortwave broadcast receiver that goes from 3 to about 6.5 megs, okay? So some nights I'll have that on my desk listening to WTWW on 5085, playing the ham shows and the oldies. This is the only kit 4 States has ever put out that has a mic jack. And it comes with the mic. It sells for about $98, I think, plus postage. The red LED on the front is a modulation monitor. It lets you know if you're clipping. It has the speaker and everything. The case, you notice how the case is built. It's made of PC board, okay? So like the Cricket had the CW key made out of PC board material, this one, the whole case is made out of circuit board. So you don't have to cut or drill or anything. Everything is all pre-printed, pre-cut and everything. All you gotta do is solder a couple of tabs and it all sticks together. So this is some of the specs of this kit. So that we don't have this monstrous transformer in there for modulation. It's a Class G modulator. Very clever design. It's interesting that when I saw it at first, he says, okay, what do you think those 2 things are? I said, oh, it must be like a push-pull set of finals. Those are the modulator. The final is one little transistor, okay? So the modulator, which is the thing that actually draws the most current in AM, is Class G. So it's actually pretty efficient. It has a synthesized VFO and digital display. That's what it looks like inside. You see there's tons of surface mount parts in there, right? You don't have to do them. There's over 110 surface mount parts in that kit. You don't have to do any. This is called a hybrid kit. All the surface mount parts are done for you. It's already done. All you got to do is the through hole part. So how many parts do you think you have to assemble to put this kit together? 30. Just 30 parts. Yes, there are 4 toroids. And those are, let's see, I don't know if they're visible in this one, but here you can see the 2 modulators and there's the final output. The CPU and everything, all the logic and everything, it's all part of the board. And that's what it looks like. That's the back end of it. It's got a power switch, power jack, and BNC. So we're going to give you a few tips. Remove the distractions. Use voicemail, things like that to answer the phone. RTFM. Yeah, that's right. Read the fine manual. That's what we say in the IT business. I use a cookie sheet to keep things from getting away. You can find them at dollar stores for $1. Don't get the foil ones, get the regular metal ones. Keeps things from getting away. It protects your surface, and if you're worried about CMOS, you can ground it. Okay? Be sure you have your batteries, power supply, things like that ready, as well as the plugs, jacks, and cables that you need to put your kit together. Make sure you have those standard parts. Get assortments of capacitors, resistors, and so forth. They don't take up a lot of space. A lot of them come pre-sorted. Keep your soldering tip clean. That's a must. And get one of those little things, I don't know what they call it, it's a tip cleaner kind of a thing, but it's got flux and solder in it. And I re-tin my tips from time to time. And make sure you use lots of lighting and magnification.
Do you recommend getting various tips for these, the Xtronics, for example, for the soldering station?
Okay, the soldering station, one of those comes with a whole bunch of different
It
tips.
comes with 5 tips, that particular one, but the one you're talking about for $59.95 does not. So
Yeah. What's interesting about that one is it uses a Hakko standard tip. Okay, so what you got to do is find out what the manual for that iron tells you what series of Hakko tips those are. So you can either get the tips from Xtronic USA, or you can get them from suppliers that have Hakko tips.
So the question is, do you recommend getting different tips for it? I'm not sure about it.
Yeah, what I recommend is, the only time I use the real thin conical tip is if I'm working with surface mount parts. Otherwise, I use a small chisel type tip, but I try not to use a tip that's any wider than the pad on the circuit board. Don't use anything wider than the pad. Now, I'm going to give you the doctor's prescription for the kind of solder I think you ought to get. And there's a guy in the swaps building that just happens to have it. I was surprised, but it's 25 bucks for a pound roll, which is pretty standard for this stuff. I use 6337. I do not use 6040. The reason is that 6337 solder is called eutectic solder. I use rosin core, no clean, and that's what they have at this guy's booth. He is in the swaps building and way to the east end.
So Dave, will you educate us dummies like me, what does 60-30 mean?
Okay, it's the tin lead composition of the solder. And it's just slightly different than 6040, but the difference is that the melting point is a couple degrees cooler, but it flows and wets a lot better. So it coats the wire a lot easier. And that is the kind of solder that's most often used by people in the electronics manufacturing industry for hand soldering is 6337, because it has an extremely brief plastic state. And what that means is, when you melt solder onto that board and that component, it cools down. Of course, you know you're not supposed to move that while it's doing it. But this kind of solder cools very quickly and does not stay in that state that would give you a cold solder joint. Unless it's dirty, it's not going to give you a cold solder joint. So that's why I recommend 6337. So where do I use 6040 solder? PL259s. The copper weld and stuff, the antenna wires, things like that, things that I want a little more physical strength, I'm going to use that 6040, but anytime I'm working on a circuit board, 6337 is the kind of solder to get. That's what I look like during sweepstakes. Any questions? Not yet. I have my call sign now with the .com, but I don't have a web page yet. But I'm gonna put that up pretty shortly. That's one of the advantages of working in the IT business. I can get my own domain real easy. So pretty soon you'll be able to go to www.K0NEB.com and I'll have all the reference material. Thank you.